That is why it is encouraging to see Wales stepping forward as one of the most significant centres of renewable resources in all of Europe. Floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea, tidal stream energy in the Irish Sea, a hydrogen hub in the north, and solar power in Pembrokeshire.
Princess Catherine collapsed when she learned the truth. Palace insiders are terrified. What was revealed in that room was so devastating that it could destroy the monarchy forever. The royal family is in total panic mode trying to contain this bombshell.
I've been inspired to go back to Mandela's writings for insight into how this could be. How he could experience so much darkness and always manage to find the light.
What dark secret did the brothers discuss? Why did Kate break down? In the fading light of an October evening, something remarkable happened at Windsor Castle. After more than 5 years of public silence and private distance, Prince William and Prince Harry found themselves on a path toward an encounter that few believed would ever take place. The meeting wasn't announced through official palace channels, and no carefully worded press releases heralded what was about to unfold. Instead, those who understand the subtle language of royal movements began to notice unusual patterns. Security personnel appeared at locations where no official engagements were scheduled. Key advisors were suddenly unreachable, their calendars mysteriously cleared for the afternoon. Both princes had unexplained gaps in their public schedules on the same day, a detail that didn't escape the attention of royal correspondents who had spent years tracking every detail of the brothers' estrangement. For anyone familiar with how the House of Windsor operates, these signs pointed to something significant happening behind closed doors. The morning of that day began unremarkably for Prince William. He attended a foundation meeting in London, participating in discussions about charitable initiatives that formed part of his regular duties as heir to the throne. However, staff members present at the meeting noted something different about him that day. There was a tension in his demeanour, a distracted quality that wasn't typical of the usually focused prince. His gaze would drift toward the windows, as if searching for something in the grey English sky that wouldn't reveal itself. Those who worked closely with him recognized the signs of a man whose mind was occupied with matters far weightier than the business at hand. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Harry had made a decision that would require him to board a private aircraft in the hours before dawn. The timing of his departure was calculated with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training in royal protocol. According to later reports from those with access to such information, the flight manifest listed just 3 people: Harry himself, a single security officer, and a confidential advisor whose identity would remain protected in all subsequent coverage of the event. The last time the two brothers had stood face to face in any meaningful way was at their grandmother's funeral more than 3 years earlier. On that September day in 2022, the shared grief over Queen Elizabeth's death had created a temporary truce between them. The loss of the woman who had been a constant presence throughout their lives, who had represented stability and continuity through all the turmoil the family had endured, had briefly eclipsed their personal conflicts. But grief, as powerful as it is, eventually subsides. When its immediate intensity faded, the divide between William and Harry seemed to have grown even wider. The years since that funeral had been marked by continued tension. Harry's memoir had been published, revealing private conversations and family conflicts in unprecedented detail. Television interviews had aired with both Harry and his wife Meghan sharing their perspectives on why they had stepped back from royal duties. Each revelation, each public statement had been analysed and debated endlessly in the media. Every photograph of the brothers at separate events was scrutinised for body language and hidden meaning. The machinery of speculation had fed on every absent interaction, every carefully maintained physical distance at the few family events where both were present. Yet something had shifted in recent months. Palace insiders, speaking only on condition that their identities would never be revealed, suggested that the catalyst for this potential reconciliation hadn't come from either brother directly. Some believed it was Princess Anne, the king's sister and the royal family member known for her practical, no-nonsense approach to life. Anne had watched her nephew's relationship deteriorate with growing frustration, and several sources indicated she had taken it upon herself to intervene. Others whispered that King Charles himself had played a role. The king, now 18 months into his reign, was acutely aware that history would judge him not only by his own actions, but by the state of the family he would leave behind. The visible fracture between his two sons was a source of deep personal pain and a potential threat to the institution's future stability. The choice of location for this meeting spoke volumes about its nature and intent. It wasn't Buckingham Palace, with its grand staterooms and portraits of ancestors who had navigated their own family conflicts over centuries. The palace represented the institution, the formal face of monarchy, and everything that came with it. It wasn't Kensington Palace either, which would have given William the advantage of being on his home territory. And it certainly wasn't Frogmore Cottage, the residence that had become synonymous with Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life and now stood empty, a physical reminder of all that had been lost. Instead, the neutral ground selected was Adelaide Cottage, a property within Windsor's private grounds that William and his family had been living in since 2022. The choice was deliberate in its intimacy. This wasn't going to be a formal summit with advisors and note-takers. This was meant to be a conversation between two brothers, conducted away from the apparatus of monarchy that had so often complicated their relationship. The cottage offered privacy and the possibility of genuine dialogue without the weight of institutional expectations pressing down on every word. As afternoon gave way to evening, vehicles began arriving at Windsor through gates that tourists never see, travelling along roads that don't appear on any publicly available maps. The security perimeter expanded in the way that only royal protection officers can achieve, silently and professionally, creating an invisible bubble around the location. Whatever was about to happen would unfold completely away from cameras, away from the commentary of experts and pundits, away from the judgment of a world that had consumed every detail of this family drama with an apparently insatiable appetite. Inside Adelaide Cottage, fires were lit in the rooms where difficult conversations would soon take place. Staff members were given clear instructions to retreat to distant parts of the property. Their presence would not be required this evening. The stage was being set for a private drama that the public would only understand through fragments and implications, through careful analysis of what would or wouldn't be said in the days and weeks that followed, and through the presence or absence of the brothers at future royal events. The expectations surrounding this moment extended far beyond the personal reconciliation of two siblings. The monarchy itself, that ancient institution that has survived wars and abdications, scandals and revolutions, now faced questions about its relevance and adaptability. Harry's departure and his subsequent public statements had exposed uncomfortable tensions that many traditionalists had insisted didn't exist. His comments about institutional attitudes, about the relationship between the palace and the British media, about prioritising personal well-being over institutional demands, had resonated with many people, particularly in Commonwealth countries where the monarchy's role was already being questioned. William, meanwhile, had maintained the silence expected of a future king throughout all of this. He had continued his royal duties without public complaint, expanded his work on issues like homelessness and mental health, and projected an image of stability that palace officials desperately needed after years of upheaval. But those who knew him well understood the personal cost of this restraint. The anger he felt at what he perceived as betrayal, the hurt that came not just from Harry's departure, but from the public manner in which private family matters had been discussed. All of this had been kept carefully hidden beneath a composed exterior. As darkness settled over Windsor, both men were making their final approach to Adelaide Cottage from different directions. They carried with them not just years of accumulated grievances and hurt feelings, but also decades of shared history. These were brothers who had walked behind their mother's coffin together as young boys in an image that had broken hearts around the world. They had served in military uniform and had once been described as inseparable, as the only two people in their generation who could truly understand what it meant to be born into the House of Windsor. The moment had arrived. The door opened, and the conversation that would define their relationship for years to come was about to begin. The path that brought both princes to this unprecedented meeting had been neither quick nor simple. It required the gradual erosion of pride, the intervention of those who cared about them, and a slow, painful recognition that maintaining their silence was extracting a cost that neither could continue to bear indefinitely. For both men, the journey toward this moment had involved deep personal reflection and uncomfortable questions about what they truly wanted for their futures. For William, the shift in thinking began in an unexpected place. 6 weeks before the October meeting, he had been visiting a youth mentorship program in Manchester. These visits were routine parts of his royal schedule, opportunities to highlight causes he cared about and engage with young people facing various challenges. During an informal question and answer session, one teenager, emboldened by the casual atmosphere, asked him a direct question about forgiveness. The young person hadn't specifically mentioned Harry or the royal family drama that had played out so publicly. Instead, they asked whether it was possible to truly forgive someone who had hurt you in a public way. They wanted to know if reconciliation required forgetting what had happened and whether real strength meant holding firm to your anger or finding the courage to let it go. William had answered carefully and diplomatically, as he had been trained to do throughout his life. He gave the kind of measured response that acknowledged the complexity of the question without revealing anything personal. But the question itself had lodged somewhere deep in his mind. In the days and weeks that followed, it kept returning to him during quiet moments. When he watched his children playing in the gardens of Adelaide Cottage, when he observed George interacting with Charlotte and Louis, when he thought about the relationships his own children would need to navigate as they grew older, the parallel became impossible to ignore. He and Harry had once been what his children were now. They had been innocent of the conflicts that would eventually find them, unaware that love and duty might one day seem to stand in opposition to each other. The bond between siblings seemed so natural and unbreakable when children were young, yet William knew from his own experience how fragile those connections could become under the weight of circumstance, expectation, and hurt. The Prince of Wales confided in Catherine about these thoughts, as he did with all matters that troubled him beyond the capacity of formal advisors to address. The princess had known both brothers during happier times before the fracture, and she carried her own complicated feelings about how everything had unfolded. She listened with the patience that had become one of her defining characteristics. Importantly, she didn't push William toward any particular decision or advocate for a specific course of action. Instead, she asked him questions that forced him to examine his own feelings and motivations. What did he want his children to know about their uncle? What story did he want to tell himself about this period of his life when he looked back on it as an older man? What would he regret more in 20 years, making an attempt to reach out or remaining silent? These conversations stretched across days and weeks. Catherine understood that her husband needed to arrive at this decision through his own process of reasoning rather than feeling pressured or persuaded by others. The institution of monarchy might demand specific responses to public situations, but the heart of a brother required its own counsel, its own timeline for healing. Harry's path toward this meeting was equally complicated and fraught with its own challenges. The move to California had provided the physical distance he and Meghan had desperately needed, but it hadn't delivered the emotional resolution that Harry had hoped for. The memoir he had published, while commercially successful and personally cathartic in some ways, hadn't brought him the peace he had anticipated. Instead, it had created new complications, sparked new criticisms, and provided fresh reasons for family members to feel hurt and betrayed. Meghan had watched her husband carry the burden of this family rupture with increasing concern. She understood that the wounds he bore were older and deeper than their relationship, that they connected to his mother's death when he was just 12 years old and to all the years of institutional life that had followed. She supported his need to process these feelings, but she also knew that some of this pain could only be addressed by speaking directly to the people involved. In therapy sessions that Harry had discussed publicly as part of his advocacy work around mental health, he had begun examining not just what had been done to him, but his own role in how the family rupture had deepened over time. This work was uncomfortable and challenging. It required him to hold multiple truths in his mind simultaneously. He could acknowledge genuine harm and institutional failures while also recognizing his own contributions to the escalating conflict. He could understand systemic problems within the royal institution while also seeing the individuals caught within it as complex human beings struggling with their own constraints and fears. The actual catalyst for the meeting, when it finally materialized, came from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, the king's sister and perhaps the family member least inclined towards sentimentality or emotional displays, had reached out to both nephews separately. Her approach was characteristically direct and pragmatic. She presented them with a stark choice. The family could continue exactly as it had been, fractured and defensive, using silence as a weapon and distance as a shield. Or they could attempt something more difficult, more uncertain, but ultimately more honest. They could try to talk. Anne made no promises about what such a conversation might achieve. She didn't suggest that a single meeting would magically heal years of accumulated hurt and resentment. She wasn't offering a fairy tale ending or pretending that all their differences could be resolved through one difficult conversation. But she posed a question that neither brother could easily dismiss or forget. In 10 years, in 20, when their own children were old enough to ask them about this period in their family's history, what would they say? Would they tell their children that they had tried to bridge the gap and failed? Or would they have to admit that they had never even tried? The logistics that followed were handled with the kind of military precision that made sense given both brothers' backgrounds in the armed forces. Dates were proposed, discussed, and refined through intermediaries. Security arrangements had to be coordinated across international boundaries, requiring cooperation between British protection officers and their American counterparts. The circle of people who knew about the planned meeting was kept impossibly tight, limited to fewer than 10 individuals who all understood that any leak would not merely cause embarrassment to the family, but would poison the possibility of having a genuine, unguarded conversation. King Charles, when he was informed about the planned meeting, responded with visible emotion according to those present. The king's own relationships with both his sons had been complicated for years, marked by his attempts to be both father and sovereign, roles that often seemed to conflict with each other. He had frequently felt that he was succeeding at neither to his own satisfaction. Understanding that some conversations needed to happen between brothers alone, without the added weight of parental expectation or the complications of royal hierarchy, Charles made the decision not to interfere in the arrangements. This would be William and Harry's conversation, on their terms. The timing of the meeting had been chosen with deliberate care and attention to numerous factors. William's children would be at school during the meeting, following their normal routine without any disruption. Harry's arrival time was calculated to avoid the periods when press attention on royal movements was typically at its highest. The meeting would take place on what appeared to be an ordinary Thursday afternoon, unremarkable in every possible way except for what it would represent to the handful of people who knew it was happening. As Harry's plane began its descent toward British airspace, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied his returns to the country, where he had been born and raised. England was no longer home in any meaningful sense, but it remained the landscape of his formation, the place where every significant memory from the first 3 decades of his life resided. Flying over the countryside he knew so intimately, he found himself trying to identify precisely when the ease and closeness of his relationship with William had begun its slow, painful collapse. The exact moment remained elusive, lost somewhere in a gradual accumulation of small tensions that had eventually grown into an unbridgeable divide. William, preparing for his brother's arrival at Adelaide Cottage, found himself moving through his home with unusual restlessness. He checked rooms that didn't need checking, adjusted furniture that was already perfectly positioned, and caught himself engaging in small rituals of nervous energy that reminded him of waiting for exam results or military evaluations. The anticipation manifested physically as tension across his shoulders and a slight nausea that no amount of rational thought could dispel. Both men understood that this meeting could unfold in several possible directions. It could mark the beginning of a slow thaw in their relationship, a gradual rebuilding of trust that would take years to fully realize. It could provide closure without reconciliation, allowing both brothers to move forward with clarity about where they stood, even if unity remained impossible. Or it could collapse entirely into recrimination and anger, with each man walking away feeling vindicated in his previous decision to maintain distance, convinced that the gulf between them was simply too vast to bridge. The one certainty was that the meeting would actually happen. After years of silence, of communication conducted only through lawyers and carefully worded public statements, of family events navigated with meticulous physical distance, William and Harry would finally sit in the same room and speak the words that had been building up like water behind a failing dam. The sun was setting over Windsor as Harry's vehicle passed through the final security checkpoint. Inside the cottage, William stood by a window watching the approach. Neither man could yet know what the evening would bring, whether this would be remembered as the night the House of Windsor found its way back toward unity, or as simply another chapter in a family tragedy unfolding in real time. The vehicle stopped, the door opened, and the final steps of a journey measured in years and miles and oceans of hurt were completed at last. Behind the closed doors of Adelaide Cottage, the first minutes unfolded with the awkward formality of strangers who had once known each other more intimately than almost anyone else in the world. William stood as Harry entered the room, and the physical contrast between them seemed more pronounced than it had appeared in any photographs from recent years. William had settled into the gravitas that came with his role, as heir to the throne, carrying himself with a weight that suggested the inevitability of his future position. Harry, tanned from the California sun and dressed more casually than any working member of the royal family would typically dare, seemed simultaneously younger and older than his brother. It was as if their divergent paths over the past 5 years had aged them at entirely different rates, leaving them almost unrecognizable to each other in some fundamental way. The initial greeting was minimal and restrained. A brief nod passed between them, followed by a gesture from William toward the sitting room, where palace staff had prepared tea that would almost certainly go untouched throughout the evening. There was no handshake, no embrace, nothing that would suggest this was anything other than what it truly was. Two men who shared blood, history, and the most extraordinary of childhoods, but who now had very little else in common in their present lives. They were attempting to find language for a conversation that felt both urgently necessary and possibly futile. William spoke first, his words measured and careful in the way he had been trained since childhood. He acknowledged Harry's journey from California, mentioned the complex logistics that had been required to arrange this meeting, and referenced the mutual agreement to complete privacy that had made it possible for them to be here at all. The Prince of Wales was doing what came naturally to him, establishing parameters, creating structure and maintaining control of an interaction that threatened to spiral into emotional chaos if left completely unchecked. Harry listened, then responded with similar caution and formality. He thanked William for agreeing to meet, for being willing to attempt some kind of dialogue despite the years of silence and the very public nature of their disagreements. But beneath the surface courtesy, a different kind of energy thrummed through the room. It was the barely contained force of everything that remained unsaid between them, years of hurt and anger seeking expression and release. The weather was discussed briefly. The children were mentioned in neutral terms, spoken of as facts rather than as emotional connection points that might bridge the distance between them. These preliminary exchanges served an important purpose, though, allowing both men to calibrate their tone, to test the atmosphere in the room, and to determine whether genuine conversation was actually possible, or whether this would remain merely an exercise in diplomatic restraint. Then William asked a question that shifted the entire tenor of the encounter. He wanted to know why Harry had actually come, not the logistics of it, not in response to whose invitation, but something deeper. What did Harry hope to achieve by being here? What did he need to say that warranted flying 5,000 miles to say it in person, rather than through any other means of communication available in the modern world? The directness was characteristic of William, reflecting his tendency to move past preliminaries when his patience had reached its limit. But it also represented a significant risk, creating an opening that could lead to either genuine authenticity or immediate confrontation. The question hung in the air between them, demanding a real answer rather than another polite deflection. Harry paused for a long moment before answering, visibly weighing his words and considering how much honesty this moment could bear. He began speaking about their mother, about Princess Diana's explicit hope that her sons would always protect each other, support each other, and remain united against whatever pressures would inevitably come their way. He acknowledged that both of them had failed that promise in different ways, through actions taken and through silences maintained, through words spoken in anger, and through opportunities for reconciliation that had been allowed to pass. He admitted that his own choices had contributed substantially to their estrangement, that in his fierce determination to protect his wife and children, he had perhaps been insufficiently protective of his relationship with his brother. The mention of Diana created an immediate and subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. She remained a presence at every Windsor family gathering, even now, more than 25 years after her death. She was the absence that had shaped so much of how both men understood family, duty, love, and the costs that came with royal life. For both William and Harry, their mother functioned as a kind of measuring stick against which all other relationships were evaluated. She was the source of their deepest wounds and simultaneously their most profound understanding of what genuine love could look like. William's response came quietly but with unmistakable intensity. He spoke about duty, not as some abstract concept that gets discussed in constitutional law textbooks, but as a daily lived reality. He described the constant weight of knowing that his choices, his behavior, his success or failure would define the monarchy not just for himself, but for his children and eventually for his grandchildren. He talked about the isolation that came with being the heir, about what it had felt like to watch Harry walk away from the institution while he remained permanently bound to it. He was obligated to defend the monarchy even when he understood and perhaps privately agreed with some of its flaws. He was required to embody continuity and tradition even when that continuity sometimes felt like a form of imprisonment. The honesty in William's words was unexpected and powerful. It represented a crack in the carefully maintained composure that he typically showed to the world. For perhaps the first time in many years, he was allowing Harry to see not the Prince of Wales, not the future king, but the man underneath all of those titles and responsibilities. He was showing Harry, the brother who felt abandoned and betrayed, who deeply resented being cast as the representative of an oppressive and outdated institution, when he too struggled against its many constraints and limitations. Harry listened without interruption, and in that act of listening, something fundamental began to shift in the room. The narrative he had necessarily constructed to justify his own choices and make sense of his departure began to admit new complexity and nuance. William wasn't simply the institution's uncritical defender, as Harry had perhaps come to see him. He was also, in his own way, the institution's prisoner. His silence in the face of Harry's very public revelations hadn't been born of indifference or lack of caring. It had been the restraint demanded by a role he had never chosen, but from which he could never escape. The conversation began to circle around the most difficult and painful territories between them. They discussed the media and the question of whose responsibility it was to correct false or misleading stories. They talked about Harry's memoir and which specific revelations William considered to be unforgivable breaches of family trust and privacy. They addressed Meghan and the complicated question of whether the institution had adequately protected her or had catastrophically failed her. They spoke about their children, about cousins growing up on different continents who were essentially strangers to each other despite sharing blood and a most unusual family heritage. There were moments during this conversation when voices rose in volume and intensity, when old grievances that had festered for years demanded full expression, when accumulated hurt sought release through anger because anger felt safer and more manageable than vulnerability. But neither man allowed the conversation to deteriorate completely into the destructive patterns that had failed them so many times before. They had both traveled too far, both literally and figuratively, and risked too much to let this encounter dissolve into just another round of recriminations and defensive posturing. At one point, William asked Harry directly if he regretted leaving the royal family and the life he had known. Harry's answer was carefully constructed, but fundamentally honest. He said that he regretted how the departure had happened, the pain it had caused to people he loved, and the permanent nature of some of the ruptures it had created in his relationships. But he could not and would not regret the decision itself. He could not wish himself back into a situation that had genuinely threatened his mental health and placed enormous strain on his marriage. He had chosen his wife and children over the institution, and given the same circumstances, he would make that choice again without hesitation. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and difficult and impossible to misunderstand. William nodded slowly, processing what it meant at its deepest level. Harry had chosen his immediate family, over the House of Windsor and everything it represented. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't even necessarily wrong from Harry's perspective, but it established a hierarchy of loyalties that could not be ignored or wished away. In response, William acknowledged something he had perhaps never said directly to Harry before. He admitted that he understood more than Harry might believe or give him credit for. He too had experienced moments of wanting to walk away from it all, of resenting the burden that had been placed on him simply by accident of birth, of envying the freedom that Harry had claimed for himself and his family. But William's choices were constrained in ways that Harry's ultimately were not. Birth order mattered in the monarchy. The inevitability of succession mattered. He had children who would face even greater scrutiny and pressure than he had faced, and he could not follow Harry's path, even if some part of him wanted to. As the evening deepened toward night and exhaustion began to set in from the emotional intensity of the conversation, something shifted once more. The exchange began to move away from accusation and defense towards something that more closely resembled genuine understanding. Both brothers were coming to realize that they would not emerge from this room as the brothers they had once been. Too much had happened between them. Too many words had been spoken in public forums. Too many wounds had been inflicted, some of them deliberately and some accidentally, but all of them real and lasting. But perhaps they could find a different kind of relationship, one built on acceptance of their differences rather than expectations of unity. One founded on honesty about the divergent paths they had chosen rather than pretense about still being a team. Harry asked about George, Charlotte, and Louis, wanting to know them as individual personalities rather than just as names that occasionally appeared in news reports. William asked about Archie and Lilibet, his niece and nephew, who existed for him primarily as images in photographs rather than as children he actually knew. In these questions, in the genuine interest both men demonstrated in each other's children, the possibility of some kind of forward movement revealed itself. This meeting was not a resolution or a solution to all their problems. It was simply an opening, a recognition that the silence between them had served neither of them well. The binary choice between complete reconciliation and permanent estrangement might admit other possibilities that they had not previously considered. As midnight approached, both men were thoroughly exhausted, drained by hours spent carefully navigating years of accumulated damage and pain. They agreed to speak again, though when and how remained deliberately undefined. They agreed that this conversation would remain private, that the public would not be treated to another spectacle of Windsor family. Drama played out in headlines and television interviews, and they agreed, tentatively and with appropriate caution, that the door between them did not need to remain permanently closed and locked. The goodbye was less awkward than the greeting had been, though still far from warm or comfortable. But something had undeniably shifted between them. Some small crack had appeared in the wall that had divided them, a crack that might, with time and continued effort, widen into a genuine passage forward. The immediate aftermath of the meeting unfolded in carefully maintained silence, in the conspicuous absence of official statements, and in the deliberate non-denial from palace sources when journalists began asking questions about unusual security patterns observed at Windsor. For those trained to read the subtle signals that emanate from royal circles, the silence itself spoke volumes. If the meeting had not occurred, denials would have been swift and unambiguous. The lack of any denial, coupled with the sudden unavailability of key advisors when reporters sought comment, told its own story. King Charles learned about the conclusion of the meeting through a brief private communication from William the following morning. The message conveyed little specific detail, but confirmed that the conversation had taken place, that it had remained civil, and that both brothers had agreed to maintain complete privacy. For the king, who had watched his son's relationship deteriorate while feeling largely helpless to intervene, the news brought cautious relief. He understood that immediate reconciliation was unrealistic, but the simple fact that William and Harry had actually talked represented progress he had feared might never come. In California, Meghan received Harry's account of the evening with mixed emotions. She supported her husband's need for this conversation and understood that his relationship with William was separate from their marriage. She accepted that some wounds could only be addressed through direct communication. But she also carried her own hurt, her own sense of abandonment by the institution and the family members who had not defended her when she felt most vulnerable. The children on both sides of the Atlantic remained largely unaware of the meeting's significance. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, Uncle Harry was already more myth than reality, a figure who appeared in old photographs and occasional video calls but had no real presence in their daily lives. For Archie and Lilibet, the extended royal family was equally abstract. Catherine learned fuller details from William during long walks through Windsor's private grounds in the days following the meeting. The Princess of Wales carried her own complex feelings about Harry's departure and subsequent public revelations, but she recognized that her husband needed space to process this renewed contact without feeling judged by her opinions. Media speculation intensified in the absence of official confirmation. Tabloid newspapers ran stories based on anonymous sources whose credibility varied wildly. Royal commentators analysed every photograph of William in the days following the rumoured meeting, searching for evidence that might confirm what had happened. Harry's return flight to California was tracked extensively, with journalists analysing the timing for clues about how long he had remained in England. Within the broader royal family, reactions varied. Some members felt relief that William and Harry had finally spoken, hoping this might ease the tension that had infected every family gathering for years. Others worried that renewed contact would simply provide fresh opportunities for hurt. The brothers engaged in sporadic communication in the weeks that followed, though not with the frequency or ease of a decade earlier. Text messages were exchanged occasionally, brief and somewhat formal, but representing contact where previously there had been only silence. They had not solved the fundamental tensions between them, but they had established that conversation was possible. It was not friendship, barely qualified as reconciliation, but it was more than the frozen silence that had preceded it. And in the context of where they had been, this represented meaningful progress.